Glenn. I'm Chief Deputy District Clerk for John Kennard, the District Clerk of Galveston County. I'm going to talk to you a little bit this afternoon about historic court records and how they represent some different historical time periods. I'm an attorney by trade, but for the last 15 years, I've worked in the district clerk's office. The clerk is the custodian of court records, and so it has been my privilege and pleasure to speak to different groups about exactly what sort of history you can find in these records. You know, folks expect to learn about history when they're at a library or maybe a museum, but they really don't think about the history that they can learn while they're at the courthouse. And history is reflected not only in these court documents, but also in judicial entries that were made in minute books, which think about that as like a judicial diary, if you will, and also in the court exhibits. So that's what I'm trying to get you to think about a little bit today. I'm going to talk a little about the efforts that have been made to restore and preserve and protect these records. So in about 2009, continuing for a few years thereafter, the Texas Supreme Court created and supported a task force for the preservation of historic court records. So what the Supreme Court recognized is that we have certainly 254 counties in the state of Texas, and that most of these county and district clerks have very valuable court records that were also very vulnerable, and they were without the knowledge and the money to properly restore those. So the Texas Supreme Court made a tremendous effort by acknowledging different historic records from all over the state. They analyzed the data, and they found out that things were being lost, not because of an intentional neglect, but just because of lack of resources. They chose records from around the state to be professionally restored. Some of those you'll see that we have here today. They're in these very hard binders. They have all been preserved page by page, and they're protected by plastic. And so we certainly appreciate the Supreme Court. Many records from Galveston County were identified as being some of the most historic and the most significant because we do have records that date back to the Republic of Texas. Our earliest records go back to 1839. So many historical time periods are reflected in these records, and I'll give you an example of some of the periods of time that I'm going to talk about. For example, the time period of when we were a republic. I'm going to talk a little bit about a case that was soon after the 1900 storm. A couple of cases, actually, that were after the 1900 storm, the periods of time around the Civil War. And again, I'll show some samples of some court documents from those periods. And I've actually brought those here with me today. So let's start with the first and, in my mind, most significant period. Texas was a sovereign nation when it gained its independence from Mexico in 1836, and that period lasted for about 10 years. And Galveston was a big part of that, serving as the capital of the Republic for a period of time. And the island was known as the Wall Street of the South during that time period. So I have some case records here from a case that was filed in 1843. These are the original case records, okay? These are not replicas. And this involved a case about competing land grants, okay? So two veterans from the War of Independence were granted land grants. Two, as it turned out, to the same piece of property on the west end of the island, okay? You can see that that's going to be a problem. One of the land grants was granted by President Houston. These are presidents of the Republic, remember? and another by President Lamar. Now, remember, records couldn't have been very good at that time period, right? We became our own sovereign nation, and then everything depended on the records that were kept. So certainly things were not going too well in the record-keeping department. And so a case was brought trying to figure out who had the superior right to this land. Well, the judge used what we would consider the wisdom of Solomon in trying to figure it out. And he parceled the land in different sections like A, B, A, B, forcing them to work together to divide and separate the land. Because indeed, if they each had every other parcel, what were they going to do with it? It wouldn't be worth anything to them. So what I have for you, and the original is over here on this table. It's got a little yellow sticky note. This is a map, a hand-drawn map from this case in 1843 that shows that portion of land on the west end of the island, and it also shows how the judge was proposing to segment and divide the land, which then forced the parties to negotiate and figure it out themselves so that they could have some true enjoyment of the land. I think that the judge realized that there was no ill intent with these competing land grants. It was just a mistake, and that both of these veterans of the war deserved to enjoy at least a portion of this land. Now, another thing that I really get a big kick out of with regard to the Republic of Texas is now we are used to seeing state of Texas versus, right? Well, look up there in the top left-hand corner. Republic of Texas versus. It's just, to me, so significant historically and otherwise to see that reflection in these court documents, where just in that moment you can see that we were a sovereign nation, no longer a state and no longer fighting for our independence, but a sovereign nation. Let's talk about a period of time that came just after this period, the Civil War. Sometimes the most significant information is what's not there. So, and I do not have this minute book with me. Now, a minute book is basically a book that includes information about all the court's activity. At our office, we have a minute book that covers the period of time from December 1st of 1859 until July 5th of 1866. So this covers the entire period, basically, of the Civil War. Now, this minute book reflects the day-to-day activities of the court in a very normal fashion. And what it doesn't include is some of the following: that during this time period, Texas seceded from the United States. Galveston was captured by Union soldiers in 1862. Recaptured by Confederate forces in 1863 during the Battle of Galveston. So these minute books reflect how important the court system and the justice system is to the stability of civilization. They are not reflecting the chaos that is going on outside of the courthouse doors. They're reflecting the business of the court exactly as it needs to be to maintain justice. Now, I know this is a little hard to see, but it says June term, AD 1863. And it starts in a very normal fashion, just like any other entry would start. Be it remembered that this on the first day of June, et cetera, et cetera. It went into who the judge was, who the district attorney was, who the justices, or excuse me, the grand jury people were, just all very basic. And just a sign that from their point of view, no matter what was happening outside of the doors of that courthouse, inside, it had to be business as usual because justice does not take a break. Inquests. I could do an entire presentation on this. I think it's the most fascinating subject. I call it the original CSI. Our office we are the custodian of inquest records from the late 1800s until about 1960. Now, what's an inquest? I know this is a term that you've heard before, but you don't hear it very often. An inquest is an investigation into the cause and circumstances of the death of a person. So, it is a formal court proceeding. It is not a criminal proceeding, okay? But it is a formal court proceeding conducted by a justice of the peace with the intent to determine if the person's death was caused by an unlawful act or omission, and if so, they were going to gather evidence. Now, again, this is one of those circumstances, and we have these records, these fascinating records from the turn of the century where perhaps a person came upon a body on the beach, or maybe somebody heard an argument and then came into a situation to find a dead person. So it's not known for certain whether something wrong was done, but they're going to try to figure it out. So an inquest is only required in certain circumstances. So if the cause of death is unknown or seems to be a little suspicious, so for example, the person wasn't in the custody or in the care of a doctor at the time, or wasn't in the hospital or known to be ill. Let me give you a recent example. One of the United States justices of the Supreme Court, Antonin Scalia, passed away while he was visiting a location, actually in Texas. Now, they had to do an inquest. Do you think that they thought it was necessarily a suspicious circumstances? Not necessarily, but he was away from his home, wasn't in a hospital, wasn't under a doctor's care, and he passes away. So they did an inquest and probably determined pretty quickly that he died of natural causes, but they still had to do an inquest. Now, these inquests include the statement of witnesses. If there was not a witness to the death, which usually there wasn't, but who came upon the body? What were the circumstances in which they found the body? They also included the testimony of doctors. So I'm glad none of y'all are eating because I find this absolutely fascinating, but it is a little gross, okay? So in all of these circumstances, you have a doctor, and not necessarily the same doctor, although I would imagine that some of these doctors ended up doing this a good bit, that would come and do an examination of the body. Now, I'm not going to go so far as to say an autopsy, okay, guys? Because I don't know that it was a full-out autopsy, but they would at least do an initial evaluation to try to determine the cause of death, if that was possible. Now, in this instance, we are talking about a case that involved a Mr. and Mrs. Willis, and Mr. Willis and Mrs. Willis were upstairs in bed. They thought they heard an intruder. Mr. Willis grabbed his gun and went downstairs. The next thing you know, you hear a shot ring out. Mrs. Willis runs to the bottom of the steps only to find her husband dead at the bottom of the steps, shot to death. She gets to screaming. Well, guess who the neighbor is? None other than Colonel W.L. Moody, as in Moody Everything in Galveston. Yeah. He comes upon Mrs. Willis laying there with her husband. She's distraught. Mr. Willis, as it turns out, there was no intruder. He had a banana in one hand, a gun in the other. He tripped, fell, shot himself. So sad. But the doctor who did the examination, said this: "There was no hemorrhage from the cut when I arrived, but from the pistol shot wound, brain and blood were oozing." Apology number 1. "The pistol shot must have been fired at a very short distance at least. This idea suggested itself to me when I introduced my finger to examine the wound and found the edges of the bone perfectly smooth." Apology number 2. And sometimes I'm giving these presentations at luncheons. I really try to be mindful of who's eating and who's not. So that was Dr. Edmund Goldman, MD. Again, fascinating bits and pieces of information, many times that also include a newspaper clipping. So if there was a newspaper article about them, for example, I've read some reports that talk about so-and-so saw so-and-so chasing so-and-so with an axe down Market Street in Galveston. And I'm like, oh my gosh. Or they talk about a drunken, naked swimming contest. Well, guess how that ended? Not well. So again, these inquests are a fascinating reflection of what life was like in these areas many, many years ago. They talk about the streets, they talk about the people, they talk about the businesses, and to me, it is absolutely fascinating. So let's move forward. Now we're at the 1900 storm and the period that followed that. I've got 2 cases to talk about with regard to this period. Now, let's just remember, the 1900 storm took place September 8th of 1900. It remains one of the worst weather-related disasters in United States history. Now, I have the original court records on that table that reflect the very last court entry before the 1900 storm. It was July 28th, 1900. Now, let me remind you of something. During this time period, you did not have judges like we have now that were at the court sitting there every day, 40 hours a week or more. No, you had circuit judges that would make their way around, and you had terms of court. So that end of July was the end of that term. The next term would have started October 1st, or the first Monday following October, the first day of October. Well, it didn't, because the storm happened on September 8th. But it did, the court reconvened, business as usual, by November 5th. Less than 8 weeks after this terrible, terrible event. Again, another example of how justice must continue to move forward in all circumstances. And the most interesting thing is, if you looked again at the minute book entries, you would see no mention whatsoever of the storm, of the loss, of the tremendous loss. But then if you keep looking, you start to see entries that make reference to the dismissal of cases because the defendant died, the DA died, the witness died, okay? So we're gonna look, this is a picture, an actual picture, but again, I have the originals over here of the last entry, July 28th, 1900, and it's just talking about certain court cases. It ended, no problem. And then here we go. Less than 8 weeks later, after we know what happened, the 5th of November, 1900, started the same way that Civil War minute book that we were talking about started. Be it remembered, on this, the 5th day of November, the same being in 1900, the same being the first Monday of said month, and the day appointed by law for convening and holding the regular term of the regular term of the criminal district court within the county of Galveston and state of Texas. Regular term. They go through and tell us who the judge presiding was, who the district attorney is, who is the sheriff, who is the clerk. They don't make one mention about the devastating circumstances that they find themselves in. To me, it's nothing short of a miracle that they could conduct business at all. And yet, think about it. You had people that were still perhaps in jail, waiting for their day in court. This is where, after you turn the page, you start to see references to motion of the district attorney. This prosecution is dismissed because of defendant's death. And so you start to see case after case after case. And that's really your only indication. If you didn't know the significance of September of 1900, you wouldn't know by looking at this until you started to kind of see all these dismissals and maybe scratched your head just a little bit. So here we are now. We're post-storm, and the seawall became one of the most important developments in order to try to protect this area from ever suffering such a fate again. So in the Texas legislature in 1901, it's the 27th Texas legislature, authorized all counties and cities bordering on the Gulf of Mexico to construct seawalls and breakwaters to protect their citizens. So guys, it wasn't just that we had the 1900 storm and we got a good idea to build a seawall. That wasn't it. The legislature actually stepped in to authorize these cities to protect themselves. Okay. So that led, and it won't surprise you, to a lawsuit from 1903 that was filed regarding a dispute between the city of Galveston trying to build one of these to protect its citizens, to protect its city, and a landowner. Now, it was specifically the person who owned the property was in the path of rail tracks that needed to be and had been installed to get the tools and all the equipment and all the materials from one point to another. And so these railway tracks were a necessity, and they were on his property. Well, he said that taking his property to put these railway tracks on was without due process of law and against his will. And as you guys can imagine, he went on to say that the running of a steam engine on his property many times a day caused him, and I quote, great annoyance. I think that's an understatement. If we had a train running in our front yard multiple times a day, I think I'd describe myself as more than annoyed, don't you think? So, fine. He did go ahead and file for an injunction. Now, that is a legal term when you're asking a court to stop something, right? So he filed asking the court, please stop the city, please stop them from doing this until we can figure out what's going on. Well, okay. He won that injunction. And they had to relay the tracks and try to go around his property until the county engineer said, you know what, you can't run a train around a corner. It was darn near impossible for them to get what they needed, where they needed it, without going across his property. You won't be too surprised to know that the city was ultimately victorious, and that was because of the overwhelming concern for the public support and safety in the wake of the 1900 storm. In Texas, we are very, very much about our property rights and the integrity of that. However, this period of time to have this case come before the court within 2 years after, again, one of the worst national and natural disasters in history, that had to play a part in this. But still, it became a critical case. One of the extraordinary things about this case is that one of the exhibits that was submitted happened to be no less than the original blueprints of the seawall. The original blueprints. Now, I don't travel with those. I used to. I don't travel with those anymore. It made everybody a little nervous. I don't blame them. So, but we have the original blueprints. Now, I know it's hard to see, guys, but what you're seeing is a portion of our land, and then you can see lines going across. Can you see at the bottom? Lines going across. Those represents the line where the seawall was going to be constructed, and also the lines where the railways were being installed. And you can see, look at how many lots of property were going to be affected. Look how many lots of property. But the safety and the well-being of the city had to come first. Now, these are not part of the court records, but these I found in the Rosenberg Library's content. And I just wanted to show you, it does show a little bit about the construction of the seawall. And there you see, do you see the railway right there? And then you see the concrete starting to come up. Okay, now let's move a little bit more in this time period. This was right after, again, this was in early 1900, about 1901. Professional prize fighting was illegal in the state of Texas at the turn of the century, but even so, Jack Johnson, an untrained African-American fighter, stepped into the ring against Joseph Choinsky, who was one of the best trained heavyweight fighters of the time. Won't surprise you to know that Choinsky knocked Johnson out in the third round, and the two were promptly arrested by the Texas Rangers and thrown subsequently into the Galveston County Jail. So, because again, not just because they were fighting, they were prize fighting, fighting for money, and that was illegal. Now, while in jail, the jailers allowed the men to do some sparring and to do some fighting. Now, this was to the delight of the crowds, guys. Think about this. The storm had happened in September of 1900. This is February, March of 1901. We all, in our memory, have the recollection of how hard it was after Harvey or after Ike or after Alicia or Carla or whatever your reference is, how hard it was to rebuild and keep moving forward. Don't you know that these citizens were looking for any bit of joy and entertainment that they could find? And that's where they found it, was through these two men. Now, both men filed documents in the Galveston County courts seeking their release, specifically habeas corpus actions. So we have those original actions. What I think is interesting is the Galveston County Sheriff, recognizing what these men were bringing to the citizens, allowed them to leave the jail each night as long as they agreed to come back the next morning. And they did. Now, Jack Johnson, who is from Galveston, went on to become the world heavyweight champion. And he attributed, through his career, most of his success to Choinsky, to what he learned from Choinsky, to the friendship that they developed, to his experiences in that Galveston County jail. And what is significant to this day about Jack Johnson is that his success challenged the attitudes about race at the time and paved the way for African-American athletes that would follow. And we have the court documents that reflect it. Again, you don't think about it. You don't think about the incredible history that is contained in these documents, and here it is. So you can see, again, forgive me, I know it's a little hard to read. So by this point, we're talking about March of 1901, and you see the state of Texas versus Jack Johnson. Then below it, the state of Texas versus Joseph B. Choinsky, and this was talking about their applications for habeas corpus. And again, just a few months after the 1900 storm. This is another entry, again, from March of 1901, showing the habeas corpus on this, the 8th day of March, came to be, on 1901, came to be heard the motion of the applicants to be discharged and likewise, etc. So they were trying to be removed and released from the jail, and we have the documents that reflect it. Now, immigration in the state of Texas. Now, my previous presentation took this matter on in great detail, so I won't get into too much detail, but let me just talk a little about the significance about this time period, again, as it represents our history. So the district clerk's office is the custodian of court records that reflect immigration and naturalization records from about the 1860s to about the 1950s, because at that time, these were not a function of the federal government. They were a function and could be filed in any court of local jurisdiction. And as we know now, these matters are handled exclusively by the federal courts, but that was not the case at the turn of the century. These matters could be filed in any location where the immigrant found themselves to be. And so we have a great deal of these documents, and great historical detail is reflected within them. So these documents that we have reflect a formal statement by the immigrant that they lawfully entered and that they intended to permanently reside in the United States. Again, we are not talking about individuals that just came for a visit. The immigrant also had to declare in what we call his oath of allegiance, a bona fide intention to renounce the allegiance from whatever ruler was over the country that they were coming from. So they had to say that they renounced their allegiance to any prince or potentate or sovereign from whatever that nation was. Just reviewing those alone gives you such a great historical perspective. Now, all of these documents, all of our immigration documents have been digitized and are available to be searched on the Galveston County District Clerk website. So Galveston County was considered to be the Ellis Island of the South. And so we were a significant port of entry. However, our records reflect the journey of the immigrants that came in from a variety of ports. And as I told the previous group, in your thinking, make a distinction between court records and port records. So even if the individual came in from another port, say New York, New Orleans, Baltimore, Norfolk, anywhere, if they lived in this area, if this is where they settled, this is where they filed their paperwork, and the Galveston County, either district clerk or county clerk, may very well have those records. Now, let's talk a little bit about the federal government. So the federal government had an Immigration Act of 1891 that excluded individuals who were lunatics. Not sure what the test is for that. It also excluded those with loathsome disease and those who had committed crimes of moral turpitude. They were not eligible for citizenship. Also, those who practiced polygamy. And as I mentioned before, I was a little confused about why in their oath and in the documents that these immigrants would file, why would they have to swear that they're not polygamists? Not that I support the practice, but it made no sense to me. Well, the more I looked into it, the more I understood. Polygamy as a practice is equated to slavery. This act that helped declare who could and could not become citizens was entered in 1891. just mere decades after our country had gone through the Great Civil War. So, if they saw any practice as being anywhere close to slavery or equated to slavery, it was going to be clear that it would not be tolerated. It would not be tolerated in the United States. And so it was not. And again, you talk about a little bit about the Chinese in California, but it was also Mormons in the Western territories that would practice polygamy. Now, immigration was originally seen as an economic issue. It was not seen as a national security issue until about World War II. The other incredibly interesting facts that we see in these documents can even boil down to which vessel brought them into the port in which they landed. So, for example, we have samples of immigrants who came in on the Lusitania. And we were all taught about the Lusitania, right? We know that the Titanic went down on her maiden voyage, but the Lusitania did not. The Lusitania enjoyed many, many voyages before being torpedoed and sunk by a German U-boat in May of 1915, killing all on board, almost 1,200 passengers and crew. So let's look at a few little sample documents for the immigration. This is a sample. You know, these documents contain such rich information and such detailed information. It will give you the person's name, their age, their occupation, physical description, including even visible physical marks on them. So this individual had a scar on the left side of his face. But in terms of researching, because many of the people that are interested in the immigration records are interested in their genealogical history. And what I found interesting about this one is that this person was born in Spain, but immigrated from Cuba. So, you know, you might not think to look in Cuban records for somebody that you knew was born in Spain, but there we go. Now we see that he came in on the vessel, the SS Bonham, and I'll read this, it is his bona fide intention to renounce forever all allegiance and fidelity to any foreign prince, potentate, state, or sovereignty, and particularly to, and in this instance, Alfonso the 13th, the King of Spain. And at the bottom, you can see that he also goes on to say that he is not an anarchist and he is not a polygamist, nor a believer in the practice of polygamy. So again, they had to swear to this. This is an example of a young woman who came over from Italy, and she came over as Grazia Citra. But when she got here, that name became Ida Grace. What's more American and apple pie than Ida Grace Citra? And again, you can see that she took the same allegiance, the same oath of allegiance to the United States. This is a certificate of arrival. This was not issued by our office, but it was issued initially by the Department of Labor and then by the Department of Justice. This is something that the immigrant could receive, typically from the port, that would show not only their name, it would show which port they came into, it would show the date they arrived, and it would show the manner, specifically which vessel. This is an example of one that reflects the Lusitania as the manner of arrival. So this was, he arrived in December of 1907. And you can see the certificate of arrival was not issued until 1941. But the certificate of arrival would reflect, as it does here, how they came in, including the name of the vessel. This is another one that I find interesting. This is a sample of a petition for citizenship. What I like about this is, remember before when we were talking about renouncing allegiance to a king or a prince? Well, this individual was born in Ireland, and was coming over, and this is who he had to renounce citizenship to. George V, by the grace of God, of Great Britain, Ireland, and the British dominions beyond the sea, King Defender of the Faith, Emperor of India. Wow, that's a long name. That's a really long name. Here is another one, and this I bring up to show, and again, I know you can't see the details, so I'm going to help you with this. So this, as you can see, the older documents were all handwritten. The more recent ones were typed. So in this instance, we had someone, he was a deckhand, and he came over from Germany, okay? And he renounced allegiance to Wilhelm II, the German emperor. This is in 1915. Let's look at this example. First of all, you can tell this is a little bit later in time, right? 1929, it's typed. This is actually a woman. And who does she have to renounce allegiance to? The German Reich. So even through the course of these documents, you see history being made right before your eyes. It gives you chills just to say the German Reich. We knew what was coming. We know what was coming. She didn't know. But these documents are just chock full of historic references that are very illuminating about this time period. So the last section of time, the last period of time I'm going to discuss is 1950s in Galveston, where allegedly there was gambling at the Balinese Room. Okay, the Balinese Room's no more, right? It was wiped out by Hurricane Ike. But allegedly, the Maceo family, there's no Maceos in here, are there? Chris, are you related to any Maceos? I'm just making sure. All allegedly that they ran a gambling house at the Balinese Room and gave people the opportunity to gamble, bet, and wager on games played with dice. Now, again, we have some of these case records, and what I find so interesting is not just the name of the individuals who were being accused, but the names of all the witnesses. I mean, you can see a list of witness names of families you still know in Galveston to this day. Now, remember, the Balinese Room was nationally known, and people like Frank Sinatra, Bob Hope, and George Burns would perform there. So this was of national interest. We have court records that reflect, for example, an indictment of Rose Maceo on the 5th day of November in 1951, saying that he kept a building, etc., for the purpose of being used as a place to bet and wager and to gamble with dice then and there played, and as a place where people did then and there resort to gamble, bet, and wager on games played with dice. Well, it probably won't surprise you to know that I believe all of the cases against the Maceos were dismissed. So no charges, nothing ever stuck, but it still reflects another prominent historical time period. Guys, I appreciate you giving me your attention today and for broadening your thoughts just a little about what you can find at your local courthouse. I have my cards over there on the table. And again, some of these original court documents there. If you have any questions, I'm open to any questions. But if not, I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you. Okay. Are we off?